Hi guys, welcome to another Animal Training Academy Training Tidbits podcast episode. And I'm really excited today to be bringing you part 2 of a 2-part episode talking with one of the Shape of Enrichment founders, Valerie Hare. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, then not to worry. I'll link to it in the show notes for this episode and you can check it out there, or just head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com, click on podcasts, and you'll be able to locate it there as well. I'm also thrilled to be able to announce that this is actually episode 30, showcasing the amazing work that industry-leading animal behavior experts from all around the world are doing. And there's plenty more sensational episodes planned over the coming wee while as well. It's been so great to have you with us so far, and it obviously goes without saying that since you are here listening to this podcast, you care about making sure that animals everywhere are getting the best possible care when it comes to their behavior management. If you enjoy this episode today and you want to assist in disseminating this information even further, one simple thing you can do to help out is share this podcast wherever you can. A really simple way to do that is just by using the podcast app on your mobile device. If you click the 3 little dots next to the name of the podcast, it opens up the settings and there's an option there to share. Push that and it takes literally about 30 seconds to run through the process. Also, I want to put a big shout out to those that have already been sharing past episodes in their social networks and with their friends. And if that's you, let me know. I'd love to hear from you and say a personal thank you for helping make this podcast what it is. We will get started though with today's episode. But before we do, and for anyone that missed the last episode, I will start with a wee introduction to the wonderful Valerie Hare. Val is currently the Chief Financial Officer and Workshop Coordinator for the Shape of Enrichment Incorporated. She's also worked as a Research Animal Care Supervisor at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Zookeeper at San Diego Wild Animal Park, a Behavioral Research Technician at the San Diego Zoo, and of course now as an Enrichment Consultant. Valerie has also served on the International Conference on Environmental Enrichment Committee since 1997 and served in the Bear Care Group Board of Directors between 2007 and 2014. She's a member of the Animal Behavior Management Alliance, the ABMA, and of various zookeeper associations from around the world. Val holds a bachelor's degree of science in biology with an emphasis on zoology from San Diego State University and an associate's degree as a veterinary technician from the State University of New York. It is without further ado and my great pleasure to once again welcome one Valerie Hare onto the show today. Hello Val, how are you?
Hello, Ryan. I'm good. How are you?
Doing very good. Very excited to do part 2 of this podcast episode with you today. And it's so great to have you with us here. Thank you for willing to come on the show once again. Let's dive straight in today, Val, with our first question. In part 1, we learned a lot about your and Shape's personal story. I wanted to start part 2 off, if it's okay with you, by talking about something else really exciting that you are involved in, and that is the International Conference on Environmental Enrichment. Can you tell people listening more about what this is, where they can find out more information, and also about the up-and-coming event happening next month in Colombia?
I certainly can. It's a very long name, the International Conference on Environmental Enrichment, so we just go by the acronym ICE. The first ICE was an independent event started by David Shepherdson and Jill Mellon in 1993. First one was held in Portland, Oregon, and they've been held every 2 years since then. As you said, the next one is in Bogota, Colombia, from May 15 to 19, and I will happily copy and paste the website URL to get you information on that. It's a long one. It's going to be held at the Parc du Jamy Duc, and I'm sure I've mispronounced that horrifically, but that park is considered to be one of the top 5 parks anywhere in Latin America, so I'm pretty excited about going there. ICE started as an independent event, but it's actually now come under the Shape of Enrichment aegis. The committee has just voted some years ago now to just have this be a Shape event. We were already the official publication. Our board of directors were the only permanent members to the committee. There was just so much incest, if you will, that it just seemed a little silly to run them as 2 separate functions. So it's held only in the odd numbered years, 2017, and in the even numbered years, a lot of our regional shapes hold regional enrichment conferences called REECs, Regional Environmental Enrichment Conference. We, over the years, have created regionals that are run under the Shape umbrella, but to a large degree autonomously from Shape International. regional. We have regionals in UK, Ireland, South and East Europe, Africa, Brazil, Japan, Southeast Asia, Australasia. Those are the most active ones. There are many others in the works. The REECs are held only in even-numbered years so that the international conference and the REECs are not competing with each other. Both of these conferences are actually really, really good ways to network, for professionals, but also for students. I recommend to a lot of university students who ask me how to get started in the business, I recommend they go to a conference and talk to people. Don't just hang out with your friends. Introduce yourself. Don't ask people to hire you. Introduce yourself, tell them who you are, what you're in school, what you're hoping for, and ask them about their work. You just need to get out there and be brave. The thing I like about both these conferences is they really appeal to a wide variety of professionals. Zookeepers is usually a core group. We do have students. We have people from research facilities, but we have a lot of researchers in the field or in related fields like welfare. We have a lot of wildlife biologists who come and share their knowledge of the captive animals from the wild, which really helps us when we're trying to manage their behavior in captivity. We have administrators from facilities. We have a lot of government officials come. I like that. So we can learn more about what their concerns are for when they're inspecting facilities. And we have a chance to educate them to be better inspectors. We have a lot of rehabilitators, a lot of conservationists. I mean, you name it. Pretty much anybody who works with captive animals may show up.
Cool. So if anyone can make it to Bogota, Colombia, make sure you get over there, and don't worry about that name, Valerie. We are infamous for butchering names on this podcast show, unfortunately. And at the conference, there's workshops and talks and other things going on?
Absolutely. In fact, in this conference in Bogota, we're actually going to be running a full shape workshop during and after the conference. It's kind of a new thing we're trying, and I'm pretty excited about it. So in the course of the afternoons at the conference, if people want to be involved in the full shape workshop, they would be required to come to certain lectures during the conference. And then the day after the conference ends, we'll all go to the park and work with the animals to do the practical aspects of the workshop. And I'm really excited about this one because it'll be the first conference in all these years that will be translated. It'll be in both English and Spanish.
Sounds amazing. And for people who want to know about future events, will they be able to navigate to an area on the link you're going to share, or do you kind of set up a new URL?
They should be able to find those on the SHAPE website. We're having some difficulties with the website, so that may be a bit behind. I'll have to look into that. Anybody, if they want to know about upcoming events, we do try and keep under new. The very first thing is called event news, so we do try to keep that somewhat up to date. But they can always email us. The general email is shape, SHAPE, @enrichment.org, and you'll get somebody, quite likely me, who will be happy to answer emails and tell you what's coming on.
All right, cool. And additionally, is there groups on Facebook that provide information about this?
This is my bias because I am not technologically up to date. Yes, there's actually a lot of very active activity on not only our international Facebook page, but also all of the different regionals and a whole lot of other groups that we connect to. So that is, of course, one of the best ways to find out. Thank you.
No worries. Hey, for this next question, I want to cover something that we've discussed in previous episodes, but I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper with you, and this is data collection when offering out animals enrichment. And specifically, I wanted to touch on ethergrams. Can you start off, Val, by telling us what an ethergram is and how someone listening gets started measuring their success of their enrichment?
Okay, so ethergram actually comes to us from the Greek language. Gram simply means a list, and etho really means nature, but it's also used to mean behavior. So it's simply a list of natural behaviors, a list of any and all behaviors that an animal of a certain species may express. When we're doing scientific studies, the ethergram can be a really important part of the study itself. In general, we don't want to work from a list of thousands of behaviors that the animal might express. So we tend to use the term ethergram to mean a list of those behaviors that we happen to be interested in. So although I know some websites you can find these giant lists of behaviors, typically what you'll do is go through and cherry pick what you want out of there. Or what I usually do is just go spend some hours standing and watching the animal either live or by videotape, and you'll get an idea of what behaviors are important to whatever the reason is for doing your study. The cool thing about an ethogram, the useful thing about an ethogram, is that behavior occurs continuously, right? And that makes it very hard to quantify. So what an ethogram does is it breaks continuously occurring behavior into little bits that we can now measure and quantify. And that makes us able to do various comparisons, as you said, in order to determine if our enrichment was successful or not. The kind of study and how you collect data really is going to depend on what results you want to come out with at the other end. Why are you doing the study? Okay. If you're doing the study, and we're going to stick to enrichment studies because that's all we're concerned with in this. If we're doing a study where we want to learn how the animal interacts with this kind of enrichment versus that kind of enrichment versus a fourth kind of enrichment, then you just need to observe the animal and collect data when each of those types of enrichment are present, okay? And your behaviors on your ethogram are probably going to be pretty, what I call small, discrete behaviors. If it's a bear, we're going to have things like sniff, push with nose, bite, push with the paw, pick up, throw. There could be any number of small behaviors that animal can do. If, on the other hand, we want to use enrichment to encourage them to use more of the enclosure, then we're going to actually look at the enclosure as our ethogram, right? So instead of push, swat, sniff, we're going to have, upper right, lower left, pool, tree, ground, whatever, okay? So what your ethogram consists of is, in fact, directed by what it is that you're trying to assess, okay? And finally, if you want to look at behavior in the sense of, if the animal behaves this way before I give it enrichment, have I affected that behavior with enrichment? And this is probably the most common way this assessment is done, where you, for example, want to use enrichment to reduce pacing. Let's go with that. In that case, what you would do is you would want to take some data in what we call pre-enrichment or baseline condition. The term condition is just used to identify what the situation is in which the animal is currently living, okay? So a special kind of condition is the baseline, where whatever is normal for that animal is what's happening while you're taking data. Some people make a mistake in enrichment studies and think, for baseline, I have to remove all the enrichment they normally have in order to get pre-enrichment data. And that's why I think that term's a little confusing. Baseline simply means whatever they currently have is what they were getting during your data collection. So if they normally get 5 enrichments on Wednesday and you're taking data on Wednesday, they would have those 5 enrichments, okay? Then the other condition that you might want to look at is called, many names, treatment or experimental, or for us, the enrichment condition. And that simply is going to be when the animal has enrichment that's new or different, whatever we're studying, okay? So you go ahead, you take those data in both of those situations, and you crank them out mathematically to be an average percent of time or whatever it is you're measuring, and you do a comparison of how much time did the tiger pace. I'm going to use tiger, they rarely pace in captivity. How much time did the bear pace in the baseline condition, and how much time did the bear pace when enrichment was present? And that's a comparison that you see frequently. And by the way, a very common result is that the pacing drops dramatically during enrichment. So this is called an A-B study. Condition A is baseline. Condition B is the enrichment phase. There is a flaw in this, okay? And that is that, remember that condition B, you're taking data while the animal is in the presence of the enrichment device, whatever it is. So by definition, the animal has something to do to distract itself, if you will, from pacing. So yes, maybe you cut the pacing down from 20% to 5%, but what was the animal doing instead of pacing? If he's playing with the enrichment only, then it's quite possible once that enrichment is gone, because it needs to get changed frequently, then the animal will continue to pace at 20% or higher. In order to figure out if that's the case, what's nice is if you can do an A-B-A study. So A is baseline, B is with whatever enrichment you're studying. And then A, again, the third condition is baseline again, okay? So you repeat the baseline after the animals had enrichment, but the enrichment is no longer present. And frequently what we see is the stereotypy will go down with enrichment. When you remove the enrichment and take data again, the stereotypy will go up, but usually nowhere near as high as it was to begin with. So what this shows you is the lasting effect of enrichment, even after the enrichment's been removed, which really, as people are starting to study this and get results this way, it's really starting to show how powerful just simple access to these enrichment devices can be for the animal. So Sarah Van Hert, who you had in an earlier podcast, mentioned that in the Shape of Enrichment workshops, we teach 3 different types of enrichment assessment techniques. And she mentioned them by name. It's Empirical, Express, and EIR, which is Enrichment Interaction Rating. I just wanted to review those really quickly since we're talking about data collection. The Empirical is the formal behavioral data collection technique that's used using scientific method, ethergrams, study designs, recording rules. This is the way that the professionals take data, and this is the way that they get accepted into the top-notch peer-reviewed journals like Science and Nature and Animal Behavior. This is not what keepers typically do. We neither have the training nor the time for this. So the second method that we teach is what we call the Express method. And I cannot say this enough. The Express method does not exist. If you go to your university professor and ask him about the Express method, he's going to have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. This is something that we made up. It's my shorthand, if you will, for doing whatever it is you can in the time allowed. Okay. Basically, we break all sorts of rules in the formal method. We break all of the statistical numbers rules. We break a lot of rules. And that's okay, because we're not trying to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. All we want to do is decide, did this boomer ball reduce pacing in the bear, period, okay? So for that bear with this enrichment in this institution, it's okay to break the rules if that's all I'm concerned about. The only problem comes into play is if you try and extrapolate that out to other bears, other institutions, blah, 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 okay? And then finally, the enrichment interaction rating is probably the most commonly used one in a zoo setting, well, most captive settings. Typically, this is going to be something like a 0 to 3 ethergram, 0 meaning no interaction, 3 meaning a big interaction, and your ethergram is simply going to determine what each of those numbers means, okay? What you do is you give the enrichment, you watch the animal for 10 minutes or so, and then you kind of step back and give it an overall number. Okay, my goal, with respect to the goal, okay, my goal was to increase foraging time. It worked pretty well. Looking down my ethogram, that makes it a 2, all right, or a 3, or a 1, whatever. That's called a direct observation. You can also do this indirectly. For example, if it is a feeding device, you can give it to the animal, go away, come back later, and look and see if the device is empty of food or not. Or has the toy been moved across the yard? These are the kind of things that give us an idea of what the animal might have done while we weren't watching. So once you give that rating a number and you record that in your log, whether it's your enrichment log or your daily keeper log, over time it becomes very, very easy to see when that starts to change, okay? Because you're going to want to take some kind of assessment for all new enrichment items. 1, to determine if your goal's been met, and 2, to look for safety issues, okay? At some point, you're going to make the decision by whatever criteria you use that I don't need to watch this anymore. It meets my goal and it's safe, okay? But periodically, you want to kind of check back in. So if you still have that 0 to 3 ethogram and you're used to using it, 6 months down the line, you can give that feeding device again and go, oh, hang on, when I used to give it, it was almost always a 3, and now it's barely a 2. Something's happening. That way, and having a quantifiable number will in fact alert you to a change faster than just, sitting around and waiting for it to come up at the tea break, So you're going to look at habituation and proficiency. I think that will really jump out at you very quickly using that method. The problem with EIR is it's restricted to just interaction. It's not the greatest thing for when you put a new climbing structure structure out there. You can make comments about if you see them using it or sleeping in it or, whatever, but it's really a little bit hard to over time get sort of an interaction rating. But, you do what you can.
Very cool. And being a data nerd, I love this stuff. Thanks so much for sharing this, Val. Now, one of the most important concepts that I try to get across in the content I create is that behavior is always a study of one. And on animaltrainingacademy.com, we've talked about training groups of animals, but we haven't really talked about enriching groups of animals. For example, a large amount of dogs in a shelter. Can we please talk about this now? How do we deliver enrichment for large groups of animals?
Okay. Well, getting enrichment to large groups of animals is fairly easy. The trick is getting enrichment that meets your individual goals when you have large groups of animals. So there's kind of two situations. And to be honest, I actually have not personally done enrichment in a shelter, although some of our instructors have. We at SHAPE agree with what you said in the beginning. We believe that enrichment should be based on individual animals' needs and wants. Things are different. Individuals respond differently, have different interests, have different histories, are different genders, are different ages, have different places in the social hierarchy. There's so many things that come into play when you're designing enrichment for an individual. But even in the wildlife facility, we have a lot of situations where we have large groups of animals in an enclosure together or just large groups of individually housed animals. So in that case, what I do is come up with sort of generic goals. Prolonging feeding time is a good one, and design enrichment to meet the need for each of the species in your group. So an example that I like to use, which is based on reality, but not the details aren't real, okay, is let's say we have 100 parrots, 1 or 2 housed in a behind-the-scenes show area, right? And we want to make sure that each and every one of them gets enrichment every day. And one of the main goals we have is to prolong feeding time. So what you want to do is design several devices that those particular species of parrot and cockatoos can use that will prolong their feeding time. And then what you're going to want to do is look at how each individual is able to use these devices. And some individuals may sort of drop out of the group as not being appropriate for this particular device, right? So going back to those 100 parrots, let's say there's 4 rows of 25 parrots, and row 1 is supposed to get a kerplunk feeder today, right? A kerplunk feeder is an open tube at both ends that has chopsticks or some other kind of barrier through holes in the kerplunk feeder, and the animal has to remove all of the chopsticks before the food can fall all the way out the bottom where they can access it. So let's say that row 1 has 25 parrots in it, and 20 of them are really, really good at using the kerplunk feeder, all right? So the feeders that those parrots in those cages are going to get are going to be a little bit difficult to use in order to prolong the feeding time. So they're going to have lots of chopsticks that they have to remove. The holes that the chopsticks are set in might be quite small, so they're a little bit tight and they really have to work to get them out. And the holes might be drilled so that the chopstick sits horizontally so that gravity is not really helping much. Okay, that's fine for 20 of the 25 animals. 4 of the animals can do the kerplunk, but not very well. They're still learning. They're not very proficient. So they're going to get easier models. Maybe there's only 2 or 3 chopsticks. Maybe the holes are quite large and angled so that all they have to do is practically touch them and they fall out. Okay, just whatever modification it takes to make that device easy enough for them to use. And now we've got one poor guy left who's got a broken beak. He's damaged and he can never grab a hold of the chopsticks properly and pull them out. He's just not able to do it. So on the day that row 1 gets kerplunks, he gets something else, a shaker box, a ball, whatever. He gets another feeding device with the same goal, but a different activity that's required to achieve that goal. So you're designing for 100 birds, okay? But out of those 100, you have to identify which individuals are not particularly proficient and which ones are frankly incapable of doing the task required. So it's kind of how I think about dealing with individuals in a group setting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's great information and a great example to use as well. So thanks for that.
I would imagine that is easily transferable to a dog shelter where animals are usually housed individually or maybe two in a kennel, and then sometimes they may have group runs or whatever.
So that's great information. And to build on this, let's build upon something you mentioned there. And a decent collection size might occur behind the scenes with show animals, or they might be small in zoos and wildlife parks. Val, can you talk about this topic and what you've seen work well in the unique setting of a show environment?
Yeah. The first thing I need to say is, Ryan, I'm not a professional trainer. I watch a lot of training. I do some training. I know a little bit about training, but I'm not a professional and I don't do shows. So you're going to have to take my comments with a little grain of salt and understand that I'm coming at this from an enrichment and welfare perspective. I have to tell you that as I travel around the world, and as you might imagine, I get to see a lot of facilities and I get to see a lot of the behind the scenes off show areas. I have to tell you that sort of generally speaking, behind the scenes show areas are among the absolute worst captive environments I ever get to see, and even in places that would surprise you. I think this stems from a couple of things. One is that a lot of people who do shows feel that the animals' enrichment is the show and the training sessions that lead up to doing a show, and that's sufficient. And the rest of the time, they don't need to worry about it because the animals are fine. I would argue that that's not really the case. The last podcast, we talked about the 5 categories of enrichment and how important it was to be holistic. Training in general, I feel, comes heavily under social enrichment because there is a communication going on between the trainer and the animal. That's how it works. And also cognitive enrichment because the animal and the trainer are learning a new language and they're learning how to communicate with each other and what does the trainer want me to do. But I certainly don't think that's a holistic approach to enrichment if that's the only enrichment they have. Further, over time, I think in particular, the cognitive enrichment aspects of it fall away. I can't tell you how many shows I've sat in the audience and watched where the animal is happily going along, doing the whole chain of behaviors they're supposed to do. And these behaviors are starting long before they get any communication from the trainer because the animal knows the show. They know the music. They know what comes next. They've done it a million times, 5 times a day, whatever. So I would argue there's not a lot of cognition going up there. I kind of liken it to, I can't tell you how many times I've driven home from work and I pull in my driveway and I go, oh, I'm home. How did I get here? I don't remember driving home because you're in such autopilot when you do it because you've done it so many times that you're not really consciously paying attention to it. And I think that's what's going on with these animals who are not being cognitively challenged anymore in their training programs. And then I think another reason for what I would call poor welfare of so many behind the scenes show areas is that the trainers need to have access to the animals in a way that typical zookeepers don't. All right. If you can get the animal through training or whatever to shift, that's pretty much all you need to do with them. Okay. On the rare occasion, you may need to do some kind of medical exam or whatever, but a trainer is going to have to let's pick a raptor. A trainer is going to have to go in and get that bird how many times a day and expect the bird to readily come out and perform. And then the bird's going to spend a lot more time back in this area unsupervised. So it has to be safe. Okay. And I think that those reasons are why we see a lot of these raptors sitting on, I think people call them bow perches. They're almost like upside down U's. And usually they're on the ground. And it's been explained to me that the reason they're on the ground is because the birds are tied with jesses. They're attached to the perch. And if the perch were elevated, then the animal could fall and not be able to work its way back up and wind up hanging by its feet, which obviously is a bad thing. And we certainly don't want that to happen. But I would challenge the people in these areas to really look in their behind the scenes areas at how their animals are spending the vast majority of their time and try some brainstorming like we talked about last time and see if they can't change things. It still has to work for the trainers. Absolutely. They have to be able to safely and readily access access these animals. But maybe there are better ways to do that work better for the birds. For example, I was in a show area a couple years ago where they had a peregrine falcon in the back. And yeah, it was sitting on a bow perch on the ground. It had a 2-meter tall cage. This was its daytime cage. It slept at night it was in a small area indoors. And then when the weather was nice outside, the animal went into this 2-meter tall, 2 meters long, 1 meter plus wide mesh cage, which is great to get the nice sunshine. But the animal had been frightened by a new trainer some time ago, and so it no longer would come to the glove when called. It had to be caught every single time they needed it for a program or to move it, to do anything with it. So all of the perching came out, and now he's on a bow perch tied on the ground in a busy area. So we did a little bit of brainstorming and realized it would be very, very simple in this enclosure to put a 2-meter long shelf that went all along the long edge of this mesh cage. And he can be just there. And to keep him from falling, okay, the shelf has to be wider than his jesses are going to allow him to go. He cannot get to the end of the shelf, period. All right. Maybe the shelf needs to be 2/3 of a meter deep, whatever is deemed to be safe. Above the shelf, running the whole length of that 2 meters up against the mesh, if we put a metal rod that's permanently mounted with a metal ring on it that slides freely up and down those 2 meters of that rod all along the length of the shelf. And then the bird can be just to the ring. And it's going to have to be fairly short because we don't want him getting tangled up in it, okay? But he should be able to freely move up and down that full 2 meters of space. So, and if we put partial visual barriers up there so he can hide or peek out to have a look however he wishes, he has the freedom to move himself around for exercise, but also to hide or to be curious at his command. And it's safe because he cannot at any time reach the end of the shelf. And the trainer still has access to him because it's not that big a shelf. It's not that big a space and he can't free fly around. So it solves everybody's problem. It definitely enhances the welfare for the animal. I guess that's my challenge to trainers, is to try and look around and see if there's some simple modifications that you can make like this that are safe, meet your needs as the person who has to do this work, but also allay some of the stress and negative welfare that a lot of these animals are experiencing.
So great. And with those last two questions, I can think of numerous groups of listeners who are really going to benefit from that information. We are sadly now heading towards the end of the podcast, Val. It's been so much fun, and we still have 2 questions left. And once again, we're heading into one of my favorite parts of the show because it's story time. Val, could you please share with everyone listening potentially 2 or 3 more stories that really stick out in your mind and some of the important lessons that these taught you?
So I was thinking about this after we spoke last time, and if it's okay, I think I'd like to go with a couple of stories that actually address multi-species enclosures, because this is becoming more and more a thing. And I think it's a great thing, by the way. I think other species of animals in the enclosure with you is one of the most enriching things you can do. It's usually very unpredictable and in my opinion, highly enriching. And so a couple of different things we've done in our workshops in these situations, I think, are really a way we want to start thinking about enrichment for the future. So the first example I thought of is one we did just fairly recently, actually, in an aquarium. We do a lot of workshops that include aquarium animals. And one of the big problems is you'll have these big 800,000 liter tanks and larger. We've worked in larger ones as well. And there's many different species in there. How do you get the right food to the right animal? And a lot of aquariums have to solve this by actually hand feeding or training the larger, the sharks and the rays and the turtles and those large fish, molas, whatever, to come up to actually get their food from the trainer directly. But is there a better way to do that where we can prolong feeding, just like we do with terrestrial animals, and take it out of a training scenario and let them get their food in a more appropriate, more natural, if you will, manner, but make sure that everybody gets the right food? And so one of the ways we've done this in several workshops now is by behavior. So first of all, targeting, for example, bottom feeding sharks and rays, they're going to have devices that are on the bottom that are designed to require that sucking mechanism to get the food out, or that they can access but bigger animals can't, things like that. Then you look at mid-level feeders, like, I don't know, some of the tanks we work in have 200-300 jackfish in there. And so we do a lot of subbuoyant or suspended feeding devices. And the beauty of that is those jacks are really annoying. They go after everybody's food. So that keeps them busy so other fish can eat. And then you have some upper level feeders like black-tipped sharks is one we've worked with a couple of times. And so we'll design feeders that are more floaty at the surface that the other animals just are naturally not going to go for when they've got something at a different level that they're more comfortable with. And then to deal with sort of all those myriad of little fish that usually we just pop the food on the top and let it float down, and there's this feeding frenzy and a lot of aggression to see who gets what. We'll distribute lots of different feeding devices throughout the tank. And one of my favorite ways is to have these really long, thin PVC poles that we attach food to. So these can easily be 3 or 4 meters tall, however tall the tank is. And food is attached to it all the way up and down. So the animals sort of naturally distribute themselves not only in different parts of the tank, wherever one of these poles is, but up and down the pole as well. So it's not that hard. It doesn't take that much work to sort of get the food using both behavior, adaptations, and distribution to get the right food to the right animals. And one of the first ones of these we really did in a workshop was actually a terrestrial example where we had primates, hornbill, and deer all in the same enclosure, a big rainforest enclosure. And a part of each one of their diet was fruit, the same fruit. Even fruits that they like. So the primate devices, we had many different styles, but they were all made with round holes that their fingers could go in and they could pull pieces of fruit out, but nobody else could get through those holes to access the food, just the primates. The rhinoceros hornbill, their devices were all long, narrow rectangles, holes. So their bill could go in, grab some food and come out, but the primates couldn't get their fingers in far enough to get the food, and they tried. And then the deer, the devices were on or near the ground, and ideally they're a little bit heavy or otherwise difficult for the birds and primates to use. So they're not going to bother because we've distributed a large number of feeders in the ways and the areas that they like to access. So they're busy. The primates are busy doing the primate feeders, the birds busy doing the bird feeders, and the deer are left alone to get their fruit out of the heavier devices on the ground, where the primates and birds don't really want to spend time anyway. So using behavior, adaptation, and just distribution really can be an incredibly effective and not difficult, not time-consuming way to feed your animals rather than having to hand feed everybody.
So great. And I love hearing these stories. Sadly, we are now at the final question, and this one is really important. I can't wait to hear your input on this, Val. Can you please share with everyone listening what you would like to see happen in the enrichment/behavior management world over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, ultimately, what I'd really like to see is that behavior management techniques are used as a matter of course in all facilities that house animals. You know, like nutrition and veterinary care is today. Behavior is important, and it's incredibly important for their welfare. And it's one thing that's just completely ignored in so many facilities. But I don't know how realistic it is to expect that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So a couple of things I guess I'd love to see people working on are, one of the problems we have today, and the internet and YouTube and Facebook and all that stuff is a great, great, great resource. But what we've seen time and again is somebody gets access to a video, often our videos, and goes, hey, I love that idea. Let's do that. And they do, but they don't do any consideration for their individual animal and what its abilities are. So there was one video that kind of went viral of a leopard standing on a swinging platform, getting its meat off of a bungee. And it's a fantastic feeding device they use in South Africa. But this was a wild-caught leopard who's only 3 years old. And he's fed this way every day, and he knows what he's doing. You know, and then I go to some European zoo and I see this thing reproduced, and the poor animal can't stay on the thing, and they fall off. I can't tell you how many heads I've seen whacked by the swinging wooden platform, which obviously isn't good. You know, people need to realize there are very simple ways to make this much easier for the animal to do until their muscle and their sense of balance and their neurological abilities are developed to be able to do the more difficult task. So I guess that's one thing is I'd really encourage people people take these ideas and use them, but make sure they're within the animal's ability. That's one thing. And while we're talking about internet, there's a lot of enrichment listservs out there, and you will virtually never see shape respond to one with an enrichment idea, because it's bothersome to me that the enrichment idea, the requests for information are, hey, what enrichment do you give your baboons, right? What I'd like to see is people turning that around into goal-oriented questions. So how about, what are some of the ways you use to increase foraging time for your baboons? Okay, now that's a question I'll answer, okay? I probably want a little more information, but I'll answer that because I know what you're trying to achieve. I know what behavior you're targeting, so I got somewhere to go with that. And then I must say I'm quite frustrated when I go to conferences still all these years later and hear people do papers on how novelty is important in enrichment. And you know what? I gave a paper 30 years ago on how important, 25 years ago, on how important novelty is. But we've learned something since then. And if you think about it, it's not always important. Look at the 5 categories in social enrichment. If you have a stable group of gorillas, do you really want to put a new silverback male in there every month or so? No, you want that stable group. So it's only certain types of enrichment where novelty or rarity are important. Oh, and food enrichment? Right. I don't think novelty matters for food enrichment. It's got their food in it, for heaven's sake. They're going to use it. The problem is that if they have it a lot, they're going to get very good at using it. And if your goal is to increase foraging time, what you're going to find is after some repetitions, the animal's going to have devised very, very quick ways to get the food out, and your goal is no longer being met. So then it's on you to modify things to make it a little harder, kind of like we talked about with the Kerplunk feeder. There's a lot of wasted space in enclosures, and I see this in a lot of reptile enclosures. Everywhere I go, for some reason, large snake enclosures are often 2 meters tall, but, a meter square on the bottom, and the snake is 3.5 meters long. And there may be one log that goes up across the enclosure, and that's it, right? So that snake has no space to move. There's so many simple, easy ways to put in climbing structures and movable branchings and vines and stuff that these big snakes can and will use if they only have the opportunity. So one final pet peeve, I think maybe if I was going to focus on one thing the world over that I'd like to see, I'd like to steal it from Margaret Hawkins, who gave a paper many years ago now called Throw Away the Dishes. I would love to go to a facility and never see a dish, because I think personally that all food that our captive animals get should be in an enrichment program or a training program or some part of a medicinal, if there's a medical reason, program. I don't really think we need dishes except maybe for water. So I guess that's what I'd really like to see happen in 5 to 10 years, that people get rid of those dang dishes.
Inspirational stuff. And let's hope that all of this transpires. And this podcast is helping to contribute to this. Val, you said, none of this stuff will happen in 5 to 10 years. You can't put a time frame on this stuff. But I like the saying, I believe it's Susan Friedman who said it, changing the world one animal at a time. And if by producing this podcast, we can get rid of a few feed dishes here and there, I think we're doing a good job. Hey, that does now bring us to the end of what has been an amazing 2-part series. I can't express how much fun this has been to reconnect with you, Val, and to record this information so that we can now disseminate it to animal carers all over the planet. From myself and on behalf of everyone listening, a gigantic bucket of gratitude to you for taking time out of your day to be here with us. It's really appreciated. Thank you so much, Val.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Hey, I hope all of you out there listening enjoyed this 2-part episode as much as we enjoyed making it. It's been fun. Really great information here. And I feel so happy knowing that we have this great medium to get it out there. And animals' lives are going to improve because of it. If you're listening to this and you want to help spread this information and play your part in improving the lives of animals everywhere, then a really small and simple thing you can do is share this episode and share word about this podcast show. One of the best places to do this is on social media, from your personal account or any relevant groups. The more places, the better. And you can actually do this straight from your mobile device in your podcast app. Right next to the title of this episode, there's 3 little dots. Click on that. There's some options that will open up. And one of these options is to share. And this is a super simple way to help out. It's all set up to facilitate this. and it takes less than 30 seconds. So if you could do that, thank you so much in advance. That's it for this episode. Toodaloo, kangaroo, and you'll be hearing from us again soon.